Marine Sergeant Marcus Thompson had seen enough war to last several lifetimes. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, he returned to his hometown of Cedar Falls, Iowa, carrying invisible wounds that no metal could heal. The transition from military life to civilian routine felt like learning to breathe underwater. Every sound made him jump, every crowd made him sweat, and sleep became an enemy he fought nightly. Marcus rented a small apartment above Miller's hardware store on Main Street. The owner, old Pete Miller, had served in Vietnam and understood the look in Marcus's eyes without asking questions. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood quiet, and most importantly, it was far from the chaos that still echoed in Marcus's mind. The apartment came furnished with basics: a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a refrigerator that hummed louder than it should. Marcus didn't need much. His entire civilian wardrobe fit in one drawer, his books in a single box, and his military decorations stayed buried in a duffel bag he never opened. The only luxury he allowed himself was a small television, mainly for background noise to drown out the silence that brought back memories. Marcus found work at the local animal shelter, a job that surprised everyone who knew his reputation as a tough Marine. But something about the abandoned and injured animals spoke to him. Maybe it was their obvious need for help, or perhaps the fact that they never asked questions about his past. The dogs didn't care about his nightmares or the way his hand sometimes shook when he thought no one was looking. Dr. Sarah Chen, the shelter's veterinarian, became the closest thing Marcus had to a friend. She was patient with his quiet moods and never pushed him to talk about his experiences. Sarah had her own story. She'd lost her brother in Iraq and understood that some conversations happened in silence. She taught Marcus about animal care, medical procedures, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a rescued animal was ready for adoption. The shelter housed about 30 animals at any given time, mostly dogs and cats, but occasionally they received rabbits, birds, or even the odd farm animal whose owner could no longer care for them. Marcus developed a routine that brought him peace. He arrived early before the volunteers and spent quiet time with each animal. He cleaned kennels, prepared food, administered medications, and slowly began to heal alongside the creatures in his care. One rainy Thursday morning in October, Marcus was mopping the main corridor when he heard scratching at the back door. This wasn't unusual. Stray animals often found their way to the shelter, somehow sensing it was a safe place. But when he opened the door, he found something unexpected. A massive German Shepherd sat in the rain, completely still except for his eyes, which tracked Marcus's every movement. The dog was clearly a purebred, with the classic black and tan coloring and intelligent expression typical of the breed. His coat was thick and well-maintained, suggesting he wasn't a typical stray. Around his neck was a worn leather collar, but no tags were visible. What struck Marcus most was the dog's posture and alertness. This wasn't the defeated stance of an abandoned animal or the aggressive positioning of a feral dog. The shepherd sat at attention like a soldier awaiting orders. Something about the dog's bearing reminded Marcus of the military working dogs he'd encountered overseas. Disciplined, intelligent, and purposeful, Marcus slowly extended his hand, allowing the dog to catch his scent. The shepherd remained motionless for several seconds, then cautiously approached and sniffed Marcus's fingers. His tail remained still, but his eyes never left Marcus's face, as if evaluating whether this human could be trusted. After this careful introduction, Marcus stepped aside and gestured toward the shelter's interior. To his amazement, the dog immediately stood and walked inside, moving with the precision of a trained animal. He didn't run to explore or show the excited behavior typical of most dogs entering a new space. Instead, he stopped just inside the doorway and sat again, waiting. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this dog was different from any animal he'd encountered at the shelter. There was an intelligence in his eyes that suggested extensive training, and his calm demeanor in a new environment indicated either exceptional temperament or professional conditioning. The absence of identification tags was puzzling. Such a valuable-looking animal would normally have multiple forms of identification. Dr. Chen arrived an hour later and was equally impressed by the German Shepherd's remarkable composure. She examined him thoroughly, finding no injuries or signs of neglect. His teeth were clean, his coat healthy, and his weight ideal. If anything, he appeared to be in excellent physical condition, suggesting he'd been well cared for until recently. The most intriguing discovery came when Dr. Chen checked for a microchip. The scanner detected one, but when they tried to access the information, they found it was encrypted with military-grade security. This type of chip was only used for government working dogs, animals trained for specialized military, police, or security operations. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Marcus felt an immediate connection to the dog that he couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was their shared military background, or maybe the way the shepherd carried himself with quiet dignity, despite his current circumstances. Whatever the reason, Marcus found himself volunteering to be the dog's primary caretaker while they attempted to locate his owner. They named him Atlas, after the mythological figure who carried the world on his shoulders. The name seemed fitting for a dog who appeared to carry his own invisible burdens with such grace. Atlas quickly adapted to the shelter routine, but never fully relaxed his vigilant posture. He ate when fed, walked when leashed, and slept when kenneled, but always maintained the alert readiness of a working animal. Other volunteers noticed Atlas's exceptional behavior. He never barked unnecessarily, never showed aggression toward humans or other animals, and seemed to understand commands in multiple languages. When small children visited the shelter, Atlas was particularly gentle, somehow sensing their vulnerability. With elderly visitors, he was calm and steady, offering silent comfort through his presence. Marcus began taking Atlas on longer walks around town, partly for exercise and partly because he enjoyed the dog's quiet companionship. Atlas walked perfectly at heel without a leash, never straying more than a few feet from Marcus's side. Local residents began to recognize the pair, and many commented on the remarkable bond they seemed to share. But it was during these walks that Marcus first noticed Atlas's unusual behavior around certain locations in town. The dog would stop at specific houses, stores, or street corners, his attention focused with laser intensity on something Marcus couldn't identify. Atlas would stand motionless for several minutes, his head tilted slightly as if listening to sounds beyond human hearing, before resuming their walk without explanation. These incidents occurred with increasing frequency, always at different locations but with the same pattern of intense focus, followed by apparent dismissal of whatever had caught his attention. Marcus began to wonder if Atlas was searching for something or someone, but the dog's behavior remained an enigma that would soon lead to discoveries neither of them expected. 3 weeks after Atlas arrived at the shelter, his strange behavior during walks escalated into something Marcus couldn't ignore. The German Shepherd began showing intense interest in the downtown area, particularly around the old courthouse and the nearby shopping district. His focused attention always centered on people carrying bags, backpacks, or packages, but not in the way a typical dog might be curious about food scents. Marcus watched as Atlas would position himself strategically when someone with a bag approached. The dog would sit perfectly still, his ears forward and his entire body tense with concentration. His nose would twitch slightly, and his eyes would track the person's movement with the precision of a trained sentinel. Most people were charmed by the beautiful German Shepherd and would stop to pet him, unaware they were being carefully evaluated. Dr. Chen suggested that Atlas might be exhibiting residual training behaviors from his previous life as a working dog. Military and police dogs were often trained to detect specific scents, drugs, explosives, or other contraband. She theorized that Atlas was simply responding to ingrained conditioning, unable to turn off years of specialized training even in his new civilian environment. This explanation made sense to Marcus, who had witnessed military working dogs in action overseas. These animals were living weapons, trained to detect threats that could save countless lives. If Atlas had been trained for bomb detection or drug interdiction, his current behavior would be a natural extension of that conditioning. The mystery of his encrypted microchip supported this theory, suggesting he'd been involved in classified operations. However, Marcus began to notice that Atlas's reactions weren't random. The dog showed no interest in most people carrying bags but became intensely focused on specific individuals. There was no obvious pattern. Atlas reacted to well-dressed business people, college students, elderly shoppers, and even children carrying school backpacks. The common factor wasn't the appearance of the person, but something about what they were carrying. One Tuesday afternoon, Marcus and Atlas were walking past the town's small shopping center when the dog suddenly froze. A middle-aged woman in a blue coat was walking toward them, carrying a large canvas shopping bag. Atlas immediately sat and focused on her with such intensity that Marcus felt compelled to move closer to see what had captured the dog's attention. As the woman passed, Atlas stood and began to follow her at a distance. This was completely unlike his normal behavior. He always stayed close to Marcus and never showed interest in strangers. Marcus found himself being led through the parking lot as Atlas tracked the woman's movements with single-minded determination. The woman stopped at a sedan and began loading her purchases into the trunk. Atlas positioned himself behind a nearby car, watching every movement. When she lifted the canvas bag, Atlas's entire body went rigid and a low whine escaped his throat, the first sound Marcus had ever heard him make. The woman closed her trunk, got in her car, and drove away, leaving Atlas staring after her with an expression Marcus couldn't interpret. This incident marked the beginning of what Marcus privately called Atlas's investigations. The dog's behavior became more pronounced and deliberate. During their daily walks, Atlas would guide them toward specific areas of town, always showing the same intense interest in certain people with bags or packages. His selection criteria remained mysterious, but his reactions were becoming stronger. Marcus started keeping a mental log of Atlas's targets. There was the college professor carrying a worn leather briefcase who made Atlas tremble with what appeared to be excitement or anxiety. The teenage boy with a large sports duffel bag caused Atlas to pace in small circles, a behavior the normally composed dog never displayed. An elderly man carrying a small paper sack from the pharmacy triggered such a strong reaction that Atlas actually pulled against his collar for the first time since arriving at the shelter. The pattern was puzzling because Atlas never showed aggression toward these individuals. He wasn't growling or displaying protective behavior. Instead, his reactions seemed driven by recognition or concern, as if he was trying to communicate something important that Marcus couldn't understand. The dog's military training was clearly influencing his behavior, but the specific nature of his responses remained unclear. Dr. Chen suggested they contact the local police to inquire about Atlas's background. If he was indeed a retired military or police-working dog, there might be records that could explain his behavior and help them locate his handler. She also recommended reaching out to military bases within a reasonable distance to see if anyone was missing a highly trained German Shepherd. Marcus made several phone calls but hit dead ends at every turn. The encrypted microchip meant that Atlas's records were classified, and without proper authorization, no one could access his information. Military bases wouldn't confirm or deny whether they had any missing working dogs, citing security protocols. Local police had no record of German Shepherds being reported missing, and animal control hadn't received any calls about a lost dog matching Atlas's description. Meanwhile, Atlas's behavior was attracting attention from townspeople. Word spread about the remarkable German Shepherd, who seemed to be investigating random citizens. Some people found it amusing and would deliberately walk past Marcus and Atlas to see if they would be selected for the dog's mysterious attention. Others were less amused, wondering if the dog posed some kind of threat. Marcus received a call from the police chief who had heard about Atlas's unusual behavior. Chief Rodriguez was a reasonable man who appreciated Marcus's military service, but he was concerned about complaints from citizens who felt uncomfortable being stalked by a large dog, even one as well-behaved as Atlas. He asked Marcus to keep the dog on a shorter leash and avoid areas where his behavior might be disruptive. This conversation troubled Marcus deeply. Atlas wasn't just a pet. He was clearly a highly trained working animal who was trying to fulfill his purpose. Restricting his movements felt like silencing someone who was desperately trying to communicate vital information. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Atlas's behavior wasn't random surveillance, but rather a response to something specific and potentially important. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when Marcus was walking Atlas through the quiet residential area near the shelter. A young man in his 20s was walking ahead of them, carrying a small gym bag. Atlas immediately became alert, but this time his reaction was different. Instead of his usual focused observation, the dog became agitated. His breathing quickened, his tail stood erect, and he began making soft whining sounds while pulling gently toward the man. Marcus decided to trust Atlas's instincts and followed at a distance. The young man walked several blocks before turning into an alley behind a row of shops. Atlas's agitation increased dramatically as they approached the alley entrance. The dog was now trembling and making continuous low whines, behaviors Marcus had never witnessed before. Peering around the corner, Marcus saw the young man meet with another individual in the shadows. They exchanged the gym bag for an envelope, a transaction that lasted less than 30 seconds before both men quickly departed in different directions. Atlas watched this exchange with such intensity that Marcus realized the dog hadn't been randomly selecting people. He'd been tracking something specific. The implications of what he'd witnessed began to dawn on Marcus. Atlas wasn't exhibiting general training behaviors. He was actively detecting something illegal. The dog's mysterious selections, his focused attention on bags and packages, and his agitated response to certain individuals all pointed to one conclusion. Atlas was a narcotics detection dog, and he was identifying drug dealers and users throughout their small town. This realization changed everything Marcus thought he knew about their daily walks and Atlas's behavior. The dog hadn't been aimlessly following his training. He'd been doing his job, trying to alert his handler to criminal activity he'd been trained to detect. The question now was what Marcus should do with this information, and whether Atlas's discoveries were leading them toward something much more significant than a simple case of a lost dog. Marcus spent a sleepless night processing what he'd witnessed in the alley. Atlas wasn't just a retired military dog adjusting to civilian life. He was an active detection dog who had been identifying drug activity throughout Cedar Falls, the small Iowa town that Marcus had chosen, for its peaceful atmosphere, was apparently harboring a drug trade that had gone unnoticed by local law enforcement. The next morning, Marcus studied Atlas with new understanding. Every behavior that had seemed mysterious now made perfect sense. The dog's selective attention to certain individuals, his focused observation of bags and packages, and his varying levels of agitation all indicated a sophisticated detection system at work. Atlas had been trying to communicate his findings, but Marcus hadn't understood the language. Dr. Chen arrived at the shelter to find Marcus deep in thought, watching Atlas with intense concentration. When Marcus explained his theory about the dog's detection abilities, she was initially skeptical. However, as they reviewed Atlas's behavior patterns over the past 3 weeks, the evidence became compelling. The dog's reactions were too consistent and specific to be coincidental. Together, they developed a plan to test Marcus's theory. Dr. Chen had access to various controlled substances through her veterinary practice, medications that would trigger a response from a narcotics detection dog. They would conduct a controlled experiment to see if Atlas reacted to these substances in the same way he'd been responding to certain people in town. The test was simple but conclusive. Dr. Chen placed small amounts of various controlled medications in separate containers, mixed them with several containers holding harmless substances, and arranged them randomly on a table. Atlas was brought into the room and allowed to investigate freely. Without hesitation, he identified every container holding controlled substances, sitting alertly beside each one while ignoring the harmless materials completely. The experiment confirmed what Marcus had suspected. Atlas was indeed a highly trained narcotics detection dog. His mysterious behavior during their walks wasn't random or stress-related. He was identifying drug users and dealers with the precision of a living drug scanner. The implications were staggering for their small town, which had always prided itself on being relatively crime-free. Marcus faced a difficult decision. He could report his findings to local police, but that would likely result in Atlas being returned to whatever agency had originally trained him. The dog had clearly been abandoned or lost, and Marcus had grown attached to his canine partner. However, Atlas's detection abilities could be valuable in addressing what appeared to be a significant drug problem in Cedar Falls. Chief Rodriguez was initially skeptical when Marcus called to request a meeting. The idea that a shelter dog was identifying drug dealers seemed far-fetched, but Marcus's military background and reputation for reliability earned him a hearing. The chief agreed to meet privately to discuss Atlas's unusual abilities and what they might mean for the community. The meeting took place at the police station after hours, with only Chief Rodriguez and Detective Lisa Park in attendance. Marcus brought Atlas and demonstrated his detection abilities using the controlled test Dr. Chen had developed. Both officers were amazed by the dog's precision and consistency. Detective Park, who had specialized training in drug enforcement, confirmed that Atlas's behavior matched that of professional detection, dogs she'd worked with in larger cities. Chief Rodriguez revealed information that explained why Atlas's discoveries were so significant. Cedar Falls had experienced a troubling increase in drug-related incidents over the past year. Overdoses, petty crimes, and behavioral problems that suggested a growing substance abuse issue. However, local law enforcement lacked the resources and expertise to effectively investigate drug trafficking in their community. The police department had considered requesting assistance from state agencies, but without concrete evidence of organized drug activity, their requests had low priority. Atlas's identifications could provide the intelligence needed to build cases against dealers and identify the scope of the problem. The chief asked if Marcus would be willing to work unofficially with the department to gather information. Marcus agreed, but with conditions. Atlas would remain at the shelter under his care, and their investigations would be conducted during normal walks that wouldn't attract attention. He also insisted that Atlas's identity and background remain confidential to protect both the dog and their investigative activities. Chief Rodriguez accepted these terms, understanding that Marcus was offering expertise the department couldn't otherwise afford. Detective Park became Marcus's primary contact and taught him the basics of surveillance and evidence gathering. She explained how to document Atlas's identifications, photograph subjects without being obvious, and track patterns that might reveal larger networks. The detective was impressed by Marcus's natural instincts and attention to detail, qualities that served him well in his new unofficial role. Their first official investigation targeted the young man Marcus had observed in the alley. Detective Park ran the description through local databases and identified him as Tyler Morrison, a 23-year-old with a history of minor drug charges. Surveillance revealed that Tyler was indeed dealing drugs, using various locations around town to meet customers. Atlas's identification had been accurate. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Atlas developed an efficient system. Their daily walks became intelligence-gathering missions, with Atlas identifying suspects and Marcus documenting their activities. They discovered that Cedar Falls had a more extensive drug network than anyone had realized. With dealers operating from seemingly respectable businesses and residential areas, Atlas's identifications led to the discovery of a sophisticated operation involving several local businesses as fronts for drug distribution. An auto repair shop was being used to launder money. A coffee shop served as a meeting point for dealers, and a storage facility housed large quantities of drugs awaiting distribution. The scope of the operation shocked both Marcus and the police. Detective Park explained that Atlas was identifying more than just users and small-time dealers. His training was sophisticated enough to detect the chemical signatures of various drugs, including manufacturing residues and cutting agents used in processing. This meant he could identify people who had been in contact with drug operations even if they weren't currently carrying substances. The investigation revealed connections between Cedar Falls and larger drug networks operating throughout Iowa and neighboring states. The small town's location along major highways made it an ideal distribution point for drugs moving between urban centers. What had appeared to be a local problem was actually part of a regional trafficking operation. Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the investigation, driven by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the military. Atlas seemed to sense the importance of their work and became even more focused and determined during their missions. The partnership between the veteran Marine and the working dog was proving remarkably effective at uncovering criminal activity. However, their success was beginning to attract attention from the wrong people. Marcus noticed they were being watched during some of their walks, and Atlas's behavior suggested he was detecting threats beyond just drug-related activities. The dog's alertness had shifted from focused detection to protective vigilance, indicating that their investigation had put them in potential danger. Detective Park warned Marcus that drug operations often involved dangerous individuals who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their business. She suggested they consider ending their unofficial investigation and turning their findings over to state and federal agencies better equipped to handle organized crime. However, Marcus felt they were on the verge of uncovering something significant that could make a real difference in their community. The decision was made. For them, when Atlas led Marcus to a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about the drug operation in Cedar Falls, during what was supposed to be a routine walk, Atlas became more agitated than Marcus had ever seen him, leading them toward the industrial area on the outskirts of town, where his behavior suggested they were approaching something far more dangerous than a simple drug deal. The industrial district of Cedar Falls consisted of several abandoned warehouses and manufacturing facilities that had closed during the economic downturn of the previous decade. Most residents avoided the area, which had become overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris. It seemed an unlikely place for Atlas to show interest, but the German Shepherd was leading Marcus directly toward the largest abandoned building with unmistakable urgency. Atlas's behavior was unlike anything Marcus had observed during their previous investigations. The dog was trembling with excitement or anxiety, his breathing rapid and shallow. He kept looking back at Marcus as if seeking permission to proceed, then forward toward the warehouse with intense focus. This wasn't the controlled alertness Atlas displayed when identifying individual drug carriers. This was the response of a dog who had detected something massive. Marcus approached the warehouse cautiously, remembering his military training about the dangers of unknown environments. The building appeared deserted, with broken windows and rust-stained walls that suggested years of abandonment. However, Atlas's continued agitation indicated that appearances were deceiving. The dog's nose was working constantly, analyzing scents that told a story Marcus couldn't read. Circling the building's perimeter, Marcus noticed subtle signs that contradicted its abandoned appearance. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel, recently disturbed vegetation near a side entrance, and the faint hum of electrical equipment that shouldn't exist in a supposedly powerless building. Atlas's detection of drug-related scents in this location suggested they had stumbled upon something significant. Marcus called Detective Park from his cell phone, describing their location and Atlas's unusual behavior. She instructed him to retreat immediately and wait for backup, but Atlas had other plans. The dog suddenly bolted toward a partially open loading dock door, moving with the speed and purpose of an animal responding to urgent training commands. Following Atlas against his better judgment, Marcus found himself inside the warehouse's main floor. The interior had been transformed from an abandoned industrial space into a sophisticated drug manufacturing facility. Tables covered with equipment and chemicals filled the enormous space, while the air carried the sharp, acrid smell of chemical processing that made Atlas even more agitated. The scale of the operation was staggering. This wasn't a small-town drug distribution point. It was a major manufacturing facility, capable of producing large quantities of methamphetamine, fentanyl, and other synthetic drugs. The equipment was professional grade, the layout efficient and organized, and the security measures suggested the involvement of serious criminal organizations. Atlas moved through the facility with the confidence of a dog who understood exactly what he was seeing. His training had prepared him to detect not just finished drugs but the chemicals and processes used in their manufacture. He was identifying precursor chemicals, cutting agents, and residues that painted a complete picture of the operation's scope and sophistication. Marcus used his phone to photograph the facility while Atlas continued his investigation. The dog led him to storage areas containing massive quantities of chemicals, finished products ready for distribution, and equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This discovery explained the network they had been uncovering. Cedar Falls was home to a major drug manufacturing operation that supplied dealers throughout the region. The sound of approaching vehicles outside sent both Marcus and Atlas into high alert. Marcus realized they had lingered too long and were about to be discovered by whoever operated this facility. Atlas's training kicked in as the dog positioned himself protectively near Marcus, his demeanor shifting from investigation mode to guardian mode. 3 men entered through the loading dock, engaged in conversation about production schedules and distribution routes. They were clearly surprised to find Marcus and Atlas in their facility, but their reaction was more curious than immediately threatening. The apparent leader, a well-dressed man in his 40s, approached calmly while his companions positioned themselves near the exits. Marcus identified himself as a local resident whose dog had wandered into the building, hoping to defuse the situation with a plausible explanation. However, Atlas's continued alertness and protective positioning made it clear that these men represented a significant threat. The dog's training was telling him these were dangerous individuals involved in criminal activity. The leader studied Marcus carefully, clearly trying to determine whether he represented a threat to their operation. His questions were casual but probing. What was Marcus doing in this area? How had he found the building? Had he seen anything unusual before entering? Marcus's military bearing and Atlas's obvious training made it difficult to maintain the fiction that they were innocent civilians. Atlas's behavior provided the answer the criminals were seeking. The dog's professional demeanor and focused attention to their chemical operations made it obvious he was a trained detection animal. The leader's expression changed from curiosity to concern as he realized they were dealing with someone who could identify and understand what they had discovered. The situation escalated quickly when one of the men attempted to secure the exits while the leader continued his questioning. Atlas immediately responded to the threat, positioning himself between Marcus and the armed individuals while maintaining his alert stance. Marcus's military training kicked in as he assessed escape routes and potential defensive positions. Detective Park's arrival with backup units prevented the confrontation from turning violent. The criminals were caught off guard by the rapid response of law enforcement, suggesting they had grown complacent about security in their rural location. Atlas's discovery had led to the exposure of what would later be revealed as one of the largest drug manufacturing operations in Iowa's history. The arrest of the facility's operators revealed connections to national drug trafficking networks that had been using small Midwestern towns as manufacturing bases. Cedar Falls' location along major transportation routes and its low law enforcement profile had made it an ideal location for large-scale drug production. Atlas's detection abilities had uncovered a criminal enterprise that had been operating undetected for years. Federal agencies took over the investigation, impressed by the intelligence gathering that had led to the discovery. DEA agents who examined the facility estimated that it had been producing millions of dollars worth of drugs monthly, supplying distribution networks across multiple states. The operation's sophistication suggested the involvement of organized crime groups with national reach. Marcus found himself debriefed by federal agents who were amazed by Atlas's abilities and the effectiveness of their unofficial investigation. The dog's training was clearly more advanced than typical local law enforcement detection animals, suggesting he had been prepared for exactly this type of work. However, his background remained classified, and attempts to trace his origins continued to hit bureaucratic walls. The success of their investigation brought unwanted attention to both Marcus and Atlas. News media learned about the dog who had helped expose a major drug operation, and their story attracted interest from law enforcement agencies across the country. Several organizations expressed interest in recruiting both Marcus and Atlas for similar investigative work. However, the attention also brought danger. Drug networks disrupted by their investigation had resources and motivation to eliminate threats to their operations. Detective Park warned Marcus that he and Atlas might be targets for retaliation, particularly if their identities became widely known. The success that had brought them recognition had also painted targets on their backs. Atlas seemed to sense the changing dynamics around them. His behavior shifted from the focused detection work of their investigation to the protective alertness of a guard dog. The German Shepherd was responding to threats that went beyond drug detection, using different aspects of his training to keep Marcus safe in an increasingly dangerous situation. The question now was whether their partnership would continue in some official capacity, or whether the dangers they had uncovered would force them to retreat to the quiet anonymity they had known before Atlas's remarkable abilities were revealed. The dog who had arrived mysteriously at their shelter had transformed their peaceful small town and exposed criminal networks that reached far beyond Cedar Falls. But the price of that success was becoming increasingly clear. Intelligence operations, the case would need to be handled with extreme sensitivity and possibly transferred to other agencies. Federal investigators who specialized in military-related cases arrived within hours to examine the evidence and interview Marcus about Atlas's behavior. The dog's reactions provided crucial intelligence about connections between civilian drug operations and classified military activities that had been unknown to law enforcement agencies. The investigation revealed that several military working Dogs had been reported missing or unaccounted for during classified operations over the past 2 years. Atlas appeared to be one of these animals, separated from his handler under circumstances that remained classified, but apparently involved the same criminal networks they were now investigating. Marcus learned that Atlas's original handler had been a special operations soldier named David Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen's younger brother, whose death in Iraq she had mentioned months earlier. The connection was devastating for everyone involved, explaining both Atlas's arrival at their shelter and the depth of his bond with Marcus, who reminded him of his lost partner. The revelation that Atlas had been David Chen's working dog transformed their understanding of the dog's journey. He hadn't been abandoned or lost. He had been a casualty of the same operation that had taken his handler's life. Atlas had somehow survived and found his way to Cedar Falls, possibly guided by scent memories or training that led him to Dr. Chen, the sister of his deceased partner. This discovery explained Atlas's exceptional abilities and his immediate trust in Marcus. The dog had been searching for a new handler who could understand his training and purpose. His detection work in Cedar Falls hadn't been random behavior. It had been his way of demonstrating his capabilities and value, hoping to find someone who would give him the working life he needed. The emotional impact of learning Atlas's true story was overwhelming for Marcus. The dog had endured trauma and loss that paralleled his own experiences, yet had continued to serve with dedication and courage. Their partnership had been more than coincidence. It had been two veterans finding healing through shared purpose and mutual understanding. Dr. Sarah Chen's world turned upside down when Agent Walsh contacted her about the connection between Atlas and her deceased brother David. She had spent years grieving David's death in Iraq, never knowing that his canine partner had survived the operation that took his life. The revelation that Atlas had found his way to her animal shelter was both miraculous and heartbreaking. Sarah immediately flew to Wisconsin to be present when investigators revealed more details about David's final mission and Atlas's subsequent journey. The classified nature of the operation meant that many details remained secret, but she learned enough to understand that David and Atlas had been involved in counter-narcotics, operations that had somehow connected to the domestic drug networks they were now investigating. The reunion between Sarah and Atlas was profound. The moment she entered the room, Atlas's demeanor changed completely. His constant vigilance relaxed, and he approached her with a gentleness that Marcus had rarely seen. Atlas seemed to recognize David's scent on his sister, responding to familiar markers that connected him to his lost partner. Sarah wept as she embraced the dog who represented her last connection to her brother. Marcus watched this reunion with mixed emotions. He was happy that Atlas's story was finally becoming clear, but concerned about what this meant for their partnership. Atlas clearly had deep connections to the Chen family that preceded his relationship with Marcus. The question now was whether the dog would choose to stay with Sarah or continue his working life with Marcus and the DEA. Agent Walsh explained that the investigation had uncovered a complex web of corruption involving military contractors, drug trafficking networks, and classified operations that had been compromised from within. David Chen and Atlas had been investigating this corruption when they were killed and separated, respectively. The drug manufacturing facilities they were now discovering were connected to the same criminal organization. The classified details of David's mission revealed that Atlas had been trained, not just for drug detection, but for identifying specific individuals involved in military-related corruption. His exceptional abilities included recognizing chemical signatures associated with particular manufacturing processes, tracking scent trails of specific persons of interest, and identifying equipment that had been diverted from military supplies to criminal operations. This explained Atlas's sophisticated detection capabilities and his ability to distinguish between different types of drug operations. His training had been designed for counterintelligence work in environments where standard detection methods might be compromised. The dog was essentially a living surveillance system capable of gathering intelligence that human agents couldn't access. Marcus learned that David Chen had died, protecting classified information about corruption within military contracting operations. Atlas had been injured in the same attack but had escaped, carrying crucial intelligence about the criminal network. His encrypted microchip contained evidence that could expose years of corruption and drug trafficking involving military personnel and contractors. The revelations transformed Marcus's understanding of their entire investigation. Atlas hadn't been randomly detecting drug activity in Cedar Falls. He had been following scent trails and intelligence that connected to the larger network responsible for his handler's death. The dog had been conducting his own investigation, using Marcus as his new partner to complete the mission that had cost David his life. Federal investigators worked to extract the information from Atlas's encrypted microchip, revealing locations, names, and operational details that had been gathered during David's final mission. The intelligence was extensive enough to support prosecutions of military contractors, corrupt officials, and drug trafficking organizations across multiple states. Atlas's arrival at the shelter in Cedar Falls hadn't been coincidence. He had been following intelligence that led him to that location. The dog had somehow known that Dr. Chen worked there, possibly through scent memories or training that guided him to David's family. His journey from the classified operation to the animal shelter had been purposeful, not random. Dr. Chen made the difficult decision to allow Atlas to continue his working life with Marcus and the DEA. She recognized that the dog needed meaningful work to heal from his trauma, and that his partnership with Marcus was providing the stability and purpose he required. However, she asked to remain involved in Atlas's life, visiting regularly and providing veterinary care for his ongoing needs. The arrangement satisfied everyone's needs while honoring Atlas's service and sacrifice. Marcus would continue as his handler for DEA operations. Dr. Chen would maintain their family connection, and Atlas would have the working life that his training and temperament required. The unusual partnership became a model for how military, working dogs could transition to civilian law enforcement roles. Atlas's intelligence proved invaluable in dismantling the corruption network that had killed David Chen. The dog's evidence led to arrests of military contractors who had been diverting equipment and chemicals to drug manufacturing operations. His testimony, delivered through his detection work, helped prosecutors build cases against individuals who had thought themselves untouchable. The success of their operations brought recognition from the highest levels of law enforcement. But Marcus and Atlas remained focused on their work rather than accolades. They had found purpose in serving justice for David Chen and preventing other families from experiencing similar losses. Their partnership had evolved beyond handler and dog to become a memorial to fallen service. Members. Agent Walsh recommended Marcus and Atlas for permanent assignment to a specialized task force investigating military-related corruption and drug trafficking. Their unique combination of skills made them ideal for operations that required both detection capabilities and understanding of military protocols. The work would be challenging but meaningful, providing them with the purpose both veterans needed. Dr. Chen established a foundation in David's memory that would support military working dogs transitioning to civilian law enforcement roles. Atlas became the Foundation's first success story, demonstrating how these highly trained animals could continue serving communities even after their military careers ended. The Foundation would help other dogs find new purposes while honoring their service. Marcus's own healing accelerated as he learned more about Atlas's story and their shared mission. Working to complete David Chen's investigation gave him a sense of closure about his own military experiences. He was no longer just surviving civilian life. He was using his skills to make a meaningful difference while honoring the sacrifice of fellow service members. The investigation that had begun with a mysterious German shepherd arriving at a small-town animal shelter had exposed corruption networks, dismantled drug manufacturing operations, and brought justice for fallen soldiers. Atlas's journey from classified operative to shelter dog to federal law enforcement partner had transformed multiple lives while serving justice. However, their most challenging discovery was yet to come. As they prepared for their next assignment, Atlas began showing signs of recognition that suggested they were about to encounter the person directly responsible for David Chen's death. The dog's behavioral changes indicated that their investigation was leading them toward a confrontation that would test everything they had learned about loyalty, courage, and the bonds between partners who served together. The final phase of their investigation began when Atlas's behavior shifted in a way that alarmed everyone who knew him. During a routine briefing at DEA headquarters in Chicago, the German Shepherd suddenly became intensely alert, his entire body rigid with recognition. He wasn't detecting drugs or chemicals, he was responding to a human scent that triggered memories from his traumatic past. Agent Walsh immediately cleared the building's common areas while Marcus tried to calm Atlas, whose agitation was escalating beyond anything they had witnessed. The dog was trembling, whining softly and showing signs of both fear and aggression that suggested he was recognizing someone connected to David Chen's death. His training was telling him that a significant threat was nearby. Building security reviewed surveillance footage to identify everyone who had entered the facility that day. Among the visitors was Colonel James Morrison, a military contractor who was consulting with various federal agencies about overseas operations. Atlas's reaction suggested that Morrison was somehow connected to the corruption network they had been investigating. Marcus studied Morrison's file and found inconsistencies that raised immediate red flags. The colonel's overseas assignments had coincided with several operations where military working dogs had gone missing or been killed. His consulting work involved access to classified information about counter-narcotics operations, including the mission that had cost David Chen his life. Agent Walsh contacted military intelligence to investigate Morrison's background more thoroughly. What they discovered was shocking. The colonel had been under suspicion for selling classified information to criminal organizations for over 2 years. However, investigators had been unable to gather sufficient evidence to prove his involvement in specific incidents. Atlas's reaction to Morrison's presence provided the missing link between the colonel's suspected corruption and the specific operations that had resulted in casualties. The dog's recognition suggested he had encountered Morrison during or after the mission that killed David Chen. Atlas was serving as a living witness to crimes that had seemed impossible to prove. The investigation team developed a plan to gather evidence of Morrison's involvement using Atlas as their primary intelligence asset. They would stage a controlled encounter that would allow Atlas to provide more specific information about the colonel's role in David's death while building a case that could result in prosecution. Dr. Chen flew to Chicago to support Atlas. During this crucial phase of the investigation, she understood that confronting Morrison would be traumatic for the dog, potentially triggering memories of the events that had separated him from David. However, she also recognized that Atlas needed to complete this mission to achieve closure and healing. The controlled encounter took place in a secure facility where Morrison was being questioned about his consulting activities. Atlas was brought into an adjacent room where he could detect Morrison's scent without being seen. The dog's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He had definitely encountered the colonel before under traumatic circumstances. Atlas's response provided investigators with probable cause to search Morrison's properties and examine his financial records more closely. The dog's testimony, combined with other evidence, revealed a pattern of corruption that had resulted in the deaths of multiple service members and the compromise of classified operations. Morrison's network had been selling information about military operations to drug trafficking organizations, allowing criminals to avoid law enforcement while maintaining their manufacturing and distribution activities. David Chen and Atlas had discovered evidence of this corruption during their final mission, making them targets for elimination. The colonel had arranged for David's unit to be ambushed during a supposedly routine operation, ensuring that the evidence they had gathered would be destroyed along with the investigators. However, he hadn't counted on Atlas surviving. The attack with the intelligence they had collected still stored in his encrypted microchip. Atlas's journey from the ambush site to Cedar Falls had been guided by training protocols that instructed him to seek help from specific individuals if his handler was killed. David had programmed his sister's information into Atlas's conditioning, knowing that the dog would seek her out if something happened to him. The German Shepherd had literally carried the evidence needed to expose Morrison across multiple states. When Morrison was confronted with the evidence from Atlas's microchip, he attempted to negotiate a plea agreement in exchange for information about other corrupt officials and contractors. His admissions revealed the extent of the corruption network and provided justice for David Chen and other service members who had died because of his betrayals. The successful prosecution of Morrison and his associates brought closure to Atlas's long journey from battlefield tragedy to federal law enforcement success. The dog had completed the mission that his original handler had died trying to finish, ensuring that those responsible for David's death faced justice. Marcus made the decision to retire from active law enforcement work. Feeling that he and Atlas had accomplished what they needed to do together, they would return to Cedar Falls, where Atlas could live peacefully while occasionally consulting on cases that required his specialized skills. The dog had earned the right to a quieter life after serving with such dedication and courage. Dr. Chen expanded her foundation to provide ongoing support for Atlas and other military working dogs transitioning to civilian life. The German Shepherd became a symbol of resilience and loyalty, demonstrating how the bonds between service members could transcend even death and separation. Atlas's story spread throughout military and law enforcement communities, inspiring new programs for supporting working dogs and their handlers. His journey from mysterious stray to federal law enforcement asset to peaceful retirement showed the importance of recognizing and nurturing the capabilities of these remarkable animals. Marcus found peace in knowing that his partnership with Atlas had served justice while honoring the memory of fallen service members. Their work together had transformed both their lives, proving that healing was possible for veterans of all species who had experienced trauma in service to their country. The ITO, small animal shelter in Cedar Falls where their story began, established a special program for military working dogs needing new homes. Atlas's legacy ensured that other dogs would receive the care and understanding they deserved after completing their service. On quiet evenings, Marcus and Atlas would walk the streets of Cedar Falls where their partnership had first developed. The German Shepherd no longer showed the intense focus of a working detection dog, but the contentment of an animal who had completed his mission and found peace. Their story had begun with theft accusations and ended with justice served, proving that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected sources. Atlas had carried David Chen's final message across states and through danger, ensuring that his handler's sacrifice would not be forgotten. In Marcus, he had found a new partner who understood the weight of service and the importance of completing the mission. Together, they had transformed tragedy into triumph, demonstrating the power of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between those who serve together.